I now welcome Bruce Guthrie to the table, and I understand that Mr. Fray and Mr. Jaspan are joining us via video conference. Wonderful. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses has been provided to you. Could you please each state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And we might start with you, Mr. Guthrie, and then on to Mr. Fray and then Mr. Jaspan.
Bruce Guthrie, journalist, editor, appearing as a private individual with broad experience in the print industry.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Fray?
Peter Fray, journalist, editor, appearing in the same manner as Bruce. As someone who, like Bruce and Andrew, worked in mainstream media, Fairfax News, and then did a startup, and now is back in independent media.
Great, thank you. Mr. Jaspan?
Yes, hello. I don't know if you can see me because the video is not operating at my end. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but I can't see you, but...
Yeah, anyway, I'll spare you that indignity. Andrew Jaspan, I'm a journalist that came to Australia to edit The Age in 2004. I then launched The Conversation, and I'm currently a professor at Monash University looking at strategic developments and media and tech issues.
Okay, wonderful. Now, there's an opportunity to give an opening statement and then we can go to questions. So, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to appear here today. I've been a professional journalist for almost 50 years. In that time, I've worked as a reporter and foreign correspondent for the major metropolitan dailies and been fortunate enough to edit some of the biggest mastheads in Australia. I'm also the author of Man Bites Murdoch, a 2010 book that warned of a toxic culture within News Corp, then News Limited, and of the dangers of giving them too much journalistic power. It ended with my sacking as editor of the Herald Sun after I reported too vigorously on a friend of a Murdoch. Within 6 months of my book's publication, the world watched horrified as the British phone hacking scandal unfolded in all its appalling detail throughout 2011 and beyond. Despite all this, a decade on, News Corp is bigger and more influential in Australia than it has ever been. And it has moved even further away from objective journalism. Increasingly, their reporting looks and reads like political boosterism. Thanks to 2017's ill-advised media law changes, News and Nine Entertainment now constitute a cosy duopoly that dominates news publishing in this country. That is now a fact of Australian life. And as my colleagues and I note in our joint submission to this inquiry, there's probably no realistic chance of going back. Better then to focus on how to create a media landscape that actually encourages rather than deters more local entrants. There's little incentive to enter the arena now. You'll struggle to make it pay. You'll be attacked relentlessly by the bigger players, and there will be little or no assistance on offer. That's certainly our experience at the New Daily, which has succeeded in becoming a top 20 digital news site in spite of all these obstacles. Our relative success was cited by the ACCC when it gave a go-ahead to the Fairfax 9 merger, but then we were expressly excluded from a government support fund because we are owned by a financial institution, industry super funds, or one of their offshoots at least. That exclusion demonstrated another very important fact that some seem unwilling or unable to grasp. Yes, journalism's business model has changed, but so has the ownership model. It must. Any investor wishing to support journalism with money, jobs and an editorial charter should be celebrated, not vilified. It is ludicrous that an American billionaire and his family can own almost 60% of the Australian print media, but average Australians apparently can't. We launched the New Daily in 2013, and I was its editorial director until last year, and I still advise on the project. It's actually a great media success story. Audience, subscribers and revenue are all growing. We have a full-time staff of 35. We have as many again working freelance or part-time. We've won Walkley Awards and we're regularly placed in the Nielsen top 20 digital news sites. But you wouldn't know any of that by reading News or Nine reports about us. They prefer to snipe, returning again and again to the same critics. It borders on vendetta. Some of these critics are within government and seem bent on further reducing diversity. Just weeks after an attack by a government senator on the commercial relationship between the New Daily and the national broadcaster, the ABC summarily ended our 7-year deal where we paid them to run their content on our site. The ABC denied a link between the senator's attack and their decision, telling us in a phone hookup it was simply because, quote, "you guys have done too well," unquote. So much for competition law, so much for media diversity. This is not how the 21st century landscape was supposed to be. In the 25 years since digital news sites started appearing in Australia, I launched the Age's site in 1996. We were supposed to see a great flowering of the industry. But a quarter century on, the top 20 websites in Australia are dominated by legacy media, with a few entrants from overseas who've also been around a very long time. Indeed, the only 21st century site in the Nielsen top 20 in Australia is the New Daily. No amount of empathy training will change the rapacious behaviour of the dominant players, so we have to find ways to make it easier for startups, large and small, to survive the early years where revenue and audience are in short supply. Some brief suggestions. Established a matched dollar funding program for employing journalists, the biggest single cost of establishing a new media business. The framework of the Small and Regional Publishers Fund, which already exists, could be used to enable this. Media organisations meeting the public interest journalism criteria to be set by ACMA and under an agreed turnover of, say, $5 million, could apply in their first 3 years of operation. Annual grants could be capped. Second, make ABC journalism available to small and medium-sized publishers through a Creative Commons arrangement, similar to The Conversation. Third, increase and extend support for Australian Associated Press. It would be a disaster if News Corp's Newswire displaced AAP, which I have no doubt is News's goal. Finally, governments, both state and federal, should mandate that a percentage of their large annual advertising spend go directly to small and medium-sized publishers, including startups. In closing, a decade ago I wrote in the preface of my book that if you regard newspapers as a protection racket, if you mess with us, we'll mess with you, then Murdoch's empire is an intimidating force. I added, quote, "The digital age provides the best chance of new voices emerging on the media landscape to challenge such market dominance. In that sense, change can't come soon enough." End quote. We've already wasted 10 years and we can't afford to waste any more time. I wish the committee well in its very important deliberations.
Thank you, Mr Guthrie. Mr Fray, have you got something you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Just a few things. I, much like Bruce, I was former editor-in-chief of the Sydney Morning Herald, and in his case, The Age. When I left the Sydney Morning Herald, I started PolitiFact, the country's first standalone fact-checking site. And as may be pertinent to the deliberations of the Senate committee, I was on the advisory panel of the first round of the innovation grants, which I think now are known as PING. And I have a few things to talk about in relation to innovation, if you'd like to ask me. Look, I'd just like to support what Bruce has said and make a couple of, as I say, extra points. We're not advocating for a mandated reduction in media concentration, as appealing as that may seem. But we do support a government-assisted expansion to create a broader, more healthy ecosystem. With the caveat, of course, that journalism has and will always have an uneasy relationship with government, and because the nature of journalism, public interest journalism, is to seek to hold governments to account. I fully endorse the idea that we establish a fund to support independent publishers and startups. it's not difficult, I should think, to agree on what criteria should be made to access that fund, but I think it should stress that it should privilege diversity and all its forms, and I'll get back to that in a second, and it should encourage startups, because we're not going to have a broader, more vibrant ecosystem unless we can find ways to encourage startups in journalism. There are a few other ideas that I know the committee has already thought about. These include giving Australians a tax credit for money spent on subscriptions, or making donations to news sites tax deductible, and giving businesses a tax credit for money spent on designated news sites. Some of those mechanisms could be used to fund the fund that we've just that I've talked about. To the above, I'd like to bring the committee to the attention of developments in the United Kingdom, where the BBC has entered into what it's called local news partnerships with local external news producers. And I do believe this has some application maybe here for the ABC. The specifics of this is that the BBC does three things in partnership with local regional news producers. Primarily, it creates a news hub, which gives access to BBC video and audio material for use online, something that I think Bruce has just flagged. It has a shared data unit. Data journalism is very much a growing area. It's the way that a lot of people receive information. And it creates this data unit which enables pieces of data journalism to be shared with regional news. And finally, there is a pool of about 150 or so local news reporters that are part funded by the BBC and the local providers to report on very important things like councils and other institutions of a local nature. I mean, I'm sure you're all very aware of the reports by ACMA and reports by the ACCC that show that we are really at a risk of having news deserts in this country. I do think I'd like to make one more point, and that is when we talk about diversity, we often talk about media ownership, obviously, and that's obviously apparent and why we should. I mean, a new report in today's Crikey by academics Benedetta Bravini and Michael Ward again reinforced the influence, the over-influence of the News Corp monolith in this country. But when we talk about diversity, I think we should also talk about diversity of voice. So as in whose stories are told and who gets to tell them. I think we should talk about diversity of form and delivery. For instance, I have a couple of teenage kids, and if I wanted to give them news, I would find a way of using TikTok rather than, say, a printed newspaper. They wouldn't know what a printed newspaper was. We need to talk about diversity of business models. We need diversity of demographics and diversity of literacies, of course, in all forms of diversity of gender and sexual identity. You have before you three white middle-aged men. Our submission was penned largely by such men with two middle-aged white women. People like us dominate the newsmaking in this country and many others. And I would argue, I would say this, but I would argue that we are very much alive to the issues that flow from that observation, and that we have tried in our various ways to be editors for everyone, for all our readers. But nonetheless, it would be great that the next time we talk about diversity in this country, next time I perform before a Senate committee, that you have before you a host of very different people who are running independent media in this country. And I would hope that your committee could do something about that too. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Mr. Jaspan?
Yes, hello there. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for this opportunity. And I wanted to reiterate what both Bruce and Peter have said, which is we're all signatories to a submission to you. I wanted to make a couple of personal points, if I may. I arrived in Australia in 2004 to edit The Age newspaper, which back then was owned by a company which no longer exists, called Fairfax. I was shocked when I arrived in Australia about the lack of media diversity and the concentration of ownership. But 17 years later, it's just really got a whole lot worse. my question, I guess, is if given the trajectory we've seen over the last 10 years or so, where do you think we're going to be in 5 years' time? I dread that. When I arrived in Australia, we had two distinct voices under Fairfax. One was the Sydney Morning Herald, the other one was the Melbourne Age. Sadly, those two independent papers, which were fully controlled by their editors, both in Melbourne and Sydney, have become merged, and they are no longer what I would call true independent newspapers, serving their own audiences with a unique standpoint. Everything is controlled by an editorial director sitting in Sydney. However, Fairfax messed up the future and as a result had to sell out to Nine Entertainment, which is where the papers are now owned. Which means that we've not only reduced two voices to one, in other words, Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, into what's commonly called the smage, but those voices now are sitting within the walls of Channel 9. The next point I wanted to make is that I wanted to briefly comment, if I may, on AAP. AAP is terribly important to the news ecosystem in Australia. It was well funded, it had a large body of journalists. However, two of its major shareholders, News Corp, or News Limited previously, and Channel 9, felt that what they were doing was subsidizing their competitors by giving their competitors access to a good quality news service. So they pulled the plug on AAP, and the new AAP has a fraction of the resources of the old AAP, and of course has lost the income of two of its biggest members, which is Channel 9 and News Corp. There was a 6-month non-compete, which News Corp were told that applied to them. That non-compete is over, and my understanding from people who are subscribers to AAP and News Corp's own Newswire service is that the News Corp service will be competing with AAP. And that will be disastrous because I would foresee AAP, the new AAP, folding. And again, we will reinforce the media concentration of the two major players. And there'll be a further stranglehold on new voices. I do hope the hearing will take this into account. Next point I'd like to mention is the conversation. After I left The Age, I founded the conversation. One of the key reasons I wanted to bring the conversation to life was I wanted to find a way to bring new specialist voices into the public arena. And I did so through working for a while as a consultant to Melbourne University. And out of that was born the idea of the conversation, which was primarily this: marry expert, subject matter expert with a professional journalist, and the journalist could help that person write in a way which is intelligible to a wider audience, set deadlines, word lengths, and so on and so forth. That's been extremely successful. However, what I was perplexed by right from the outset was the hostility of the Australian in particular to the conversation, with the exception, I should say, of Mark Day, who wrote a couple of very good pieces about the conversation. And I didn't really understand what this was about until I met somebody from Universities Australia who told me that they had been lobbied by the Australian higher education section to find a way to stop the funding of the conversation. And the reason that they gave was that the conversation was a threat to the readership and the advertising revenue of the higher education section of the Australian. Furthermore, I was in talks with the Department of Education, which was then headed up by Minister Christopher Pyne, about continuing with some funding support that the Australian government was providing the conversation. I should have said, by the way, that other funders included 5 major universities, CSIRO, the Victorian State Government, and CBA Bank. But we received at that time $1 million a year funding from the Australian government. And I was in discussions with the Department of Education, and the night before the budget, because they hadn't indicated to me whether they would continue funding or not, I received a call from a senior reporter at the Australian to gleefully tell me that we would no longer be getting any funding from the Australian government. So this didn't come through the department, but through a reporter at the Australian, and wanted my reaction, which I didn't give. The next point I wanted to make, if I may, is that the News Code legislation, which is now being applied, was largely scripted and driven by News Corp. And that's why the biggest beneficiaries are News Corp and Nine Entertainment. The smaller players have been bought off with smallish sums of around 200 to 250,000 a year. But the deal simply reinforces media concentration. By the way, as you're probably aware, Google and Facebook offshore their billing around 5 to 6 billion a year is offshored through Singapore and through Ireland. And in this way, they can get around the Australian tax laws. One question I'm not sure if the committee has also established is how much company tax News Corp actually pays on its Australian activities and revenues. I also am not sure if the committee has managed to establish where News Corp's ultimate ownership is registered. Is it in Australia or Delaware or in a tax haven? My understanding is that Foxtel has shifted its ultimate ownership to Delaware in the US. So the key question now is what can be done to support media diversity? And again, I echo the points made by Peter Fray and Bruce Guthrie. What we need is a different approach as outlined in our submission. In particular, we need to find a way to address areas of market failure through the establishment of a new funding mechanism. Grants could be provided to high journalists to provide watchdog coverage of town halls, courts and police rounds, of regional and community Australia, specialist reporting in the areas of science, environment, health, etc., all areas now sadly neglected. I've also sent to you, and I hope you've received it, my submission, which was made at the invitation of Rod Sims to the ACCC, about a 10% levy to be imposed on Google and Facebook revenues, which could support new public interest journalism. I pass these links to the committee. I hope you have them.
We do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my real issue here is something must be done about this spiraling concentration, or we need to face a media landscape without diversity.
Thank you.
What is the real issue we face here with media concentration? It entrenches excessive political and ideological power in the hands of a few, giving them the ability to set the public agenda, determine political decision-making, public policy, and media policy. If we want to have a proper functioning liberal democracy in Australia, we need to understand that we now face an unprecedented and real threat to that democracy. We urge you to do something before it's too late.
Thank you, and thank you to all three of you for your opening statements. I might just kick off briefly and then I'll hand over to Senator Carr. All of you have spoken about the influence of the Murdoch press in terms of the lack of media diversity in Australia, but you've all spoken about the intimidating nature that they treat competitors with. I find this interesting because we've heard from several witnesses just this morning, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, we heard from Kevin Rudd previously, we've heard from others, that this type of intimidating behaviour is not just directed at news competitors, but at anyone who doesn't fit their agenda, whether that is politicians or indeed, as we heard today, very disturbingly, scientists, the people actually doing the work, shooting the messenger, shall we say. I'd like to know from, and perhaps Mr Guthrie, you're well positioned to answer this, seeing as you used to work for a News Corp newspaper. Is this new, this attitude, this approach that the Murdoch press take or that perhaps is it coming from Mr. Murdoch himself, or is it his executives? Is this new, or has this always been thus? And we've just got to a point where it is now so problematic because there's less and less competitors.
It's always been thus. When I worked there, when I was editing the Weekend Australian, this is on a lower level than science, but I remember the Weekend Australian magazine was going to press, and I had a small story on Andrew Denton, a innocuous story, probably 300 words. And I was warned as the magazine went to press that he was perceived as an enemy of News Corp. And I said, why on earth would Andrew Denton be And they said, well, Super League. He challenged them on Super League. Anyway, I let the magazine go. I thought, ridiculous. And 3 weeks later, I got an angry call from the editor saying, why did you put Andrew Denton in the magazine? And I said, well, that was 3 weeks ago. And he said, Lachlan's just read it in New York and he's hit the roof. What do I tell him? And I said, I don't know. What do I tell him? And he said, well, you know, Andrew's on an enemies list. And I said, well, who else is on this list? And he said, oh, you'll find out. So there's this sort of known group within News Corp that expands all the time of people who are regarded as, if they're not friends, they're enemies of News Corp, just as there are friends of News Corp. And friends are rewarded and enemies are punished. And in my observation is in the decade since I left News Corp, that's just gotten worse because they've gotten bigger. And until I don't know what we can do. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. But yes, when I sued News Corp, I would come out of court and I won a breach of contract action which went on for 6 days in the Supreme Court. I would come out of court each day and I would open up the paper in the morning, and what I said what happened in the court bore no resemblance to what was reported. And I realised there's two kinds of truth. There's the truth and there's what News Limited says is the truth. And sometimes that's more important and more powerful and gets more traction.
Thank you. Does anybody, Mr. Fray, do you have anything to add in terms of whether things have gotten worse?
Yeah, just a couple of things really. I think we should, just for context, look, all news organisations get it in their head that they have enemies and friends and what have you, or they believe so-and-so needs to be brought down a peg or what have you. I mean, this power has been abused for decades. I think what we see, though, in news is a particular brand of it, and the key characteristics are frequency and intensity. It's the frequency of the attacks. So once you are a News Corp enemy, you will be attacked frequently, every day, every other day, and it will be intensive. So, as I say, if you were Eddie Obeid, you probably think that the Sydney Morning Herald has been out to get you forever. But the Sydney Morning Herald has done incredible journalism to bring Eddie Obeid under control and to expose his corrupt ways. It's a different kettle of fish if it's frequent and intense and really bears very little at times resemblance to proper reporting.
Or truth.
Or truth, of course.
Senator Carr.
Well, if I could come to your submission, first of all, you're suggesting there's a loss of 5,000 jobs over the last 10 years. Is that based on the MEAA's figures, or do you have some other evidence?
It's the accepted figure within the industry, and I noticed the Get Up report has also quoted that figure today, Senator.
And is that a result of the concentration of media ownership, tech change, or what do you think has caused that loss of that size?
All of those things. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the demise of the print business model, which was enormously successful for a long time, very profitable. I think when I edited The Age, 40 cents of every dollar fell to the bottom line. Now it's probably 2 to 3 cents. So it's a huge change in the business model. It's been particularly harsh in regional areas, and the level of reporting in regional Australia must be threadbare now. So it's a combination of things, and also companies just looking for savings.
You talk about the underreporting in this country, local mastheads in regional Australia being closed is the obvious example, but it could also apply, I would have thought, in metropolitan Australia. We think about the situation in the courts, we think about local councils, police rounds. I mean, there was a time, and I remember in my time in politics, when you talk to journalists that were actually trained at the round level, you know, so they have some grasp of how society worked, some grasp about people, some understanding of institutional structures. That's all gone. I mean, what do you think of the consequences for democracy of the decline in that type of reporting?
Can I answer this question?
And others may wish to chip in if they feel.
I'll just make the point that all of what you say is true. As numbers have shrunk within newsrooms, younger reporters particularly are being asked to do more earlier, and the training has fallen away. The other thing that's at work here, though, is what I call the digital race to the bottom, because the way to pay the bills these days is programmatic advertising, which is essentially it's like the share market, buyers and sellers. Predominantly owned by Google. They make a fortune out of it, take the biggest cut of all. I know the ACCC is looking at that. But in order to get numbers, you're not going to get that by publishing 3 week long investigations into issues that matter. But you might get a big number if you publish Kim Kardashian splits with Kanye. And so increasingly what happens is that websites are now going for that clickbait. And so journalism is a race to the bottom. And young journalists particularly are being asked to do that stuff, and they can frankly write it off someone else's screen. So we've got a lack of training, we've got a race to the bottom, and a recognition that perhaps the best journalism doesn't get rewarded with clicks.
And so, Mr. Fray, would you like to say anything on that matter?
Yes, I would. I would like to say that we live in the age of the audience. The digital revolution, which is, with us and will be with us for a very, very long time, has created capacity, and I'm being a positive statement here, has created capacity for news journalism to have highly skilled specialist journalists who can react to and work with their audiences. I mean, the website I spend most of my time running, Fray, is a subscription-based model. And we have, hopefully, an ever-deepening relationship with our audience. So we don't have, my point is, and this is bouncing off what Bruce just said, we do not race to the bottom. It's not the only business model. Just to the observation you made, Senator, I agree with you that we have seen a terrible loss of skills from the industry. But I would say, and I say this as a former teacher of journalism, that the new crop coming through are fantastic. They are imbued with a very, very strong sense of public interest journalism.
Yes.
And they are looking to institutions like the Senate to assist them on their way.
Well, we'll come to that. Don't worry, you'll get the opportunity to come to that. But I'm particularly concerned about this decline in standards in journalism. Mr. Guthrie's mentioned the training, and Mr. Jaspan, your experience, I mean, in your term, I recall the age in your time, actually trained people to work in the courts, and I give that as a specific example, to work in the police round, and you would rotate people through a range of rounds so they got a broader grasp of how society actually functioned. Now, can it be said that independent publications are able to address those declines, for instance, in court reporting? Where do I find that? I could say the same about science reporting. How many science reporters are there really now in the country in terms of specialists compared to what there were when you were all editing the major mastheads in this country. Industrial relations reporting. How many serious industrial relations reporters are there, experts who actually know how the labour movement functions, how individual unions function, understand how companies function, have that grasp of how the economy functions at that level? Could you comment on that?
Andrew? Well, it's a good point. I had 4 years covering industrial relations, 2 of them at Trades Hall and 2 at the Arbitration Commission, which was character building to say the least. But you're right. I mean, when I started in the 70s, you did the health round, you did police round, you did courts, and now newsrooms are threadbare compared to those days. And so journalists, the upside, to go to Peter's point, is they're getting exposed to kind of the pointy end of journalism much faster, but many of them are learning on the run. That said, Senator, certainly when I was at the Herald Sun, certainly when I was at The Age, they were still taking on interns, and often, you know, a dozen a year, and they were still trying to maintain.
But they
that
rotated
system.
them through. You know, I mean,
Yep.
I worked in the industry, you know, from another end of it. I mean, at your time when those publications, and I say to you, most of the senior journalists from that time have now been made redundant.
That's right.
When you talk to a modern trained journalist, their grasp of history, their understanding of the breadth of the topic is so much more limited.
But simply, in many cases, they're being expected to fill the shoes of the redundant journalists who had 25, 30 years experience with 5 years experience under their belt. And we're asking a lot of them. And there are gaps.
I think massive gaps. And the reason I come to this point, and I know, Mr. Jaspan, I did ask you the question. I don't think of. But
I'm here.
We've just done a Senate report here on the question of populism and democracy in this country, and the effects, particularly around the issue of trust in public institutions. Do you, and I ask all of you perhaps to comment on this, has the level of trust in journalism in this country declined in your judgment?
Senator Carr, I might kick this off. The first thing is all your points, in a sense, are an intrusion into private grief that we all share. When I joined The Age, I had 350 journalists working for The Age. The figure is now down to well below half that number. And what Bruce just said a moment ago, what you've done is lost the expertise, lost the specialist reporters, brought in general reporters, and the general reporters are under the command of bean counters or people who check productivity, and they expect 3 or 4 stories a day, not 1 a week or whatever else. So this is a real problem we face, but it is a product of the changed or broken business model, which is why I have put forward with my colleagues a way of addressing this problem. In terms of your question on trust, trust is part of that story as well. If you aren't able to leave the office because you have to write 2 or 3 stories a day, and you do it on the basis of desktop research and occasionally getting somebody to answer your phone call, the level of expertise, the depth and understanding of the story is limited. And the readers can see through this. And I think the bonds that the readers have with the media outlet are loosened as they begin to see this is not much better than what I can get elsewhere, or should I bother reading this at all? I'm not just talking about the print product here, also online.
I think that's right.
But there have also been, as you're aware, and I don't want to drift into the Australian context here, but you're well aware of highly publicised bad behaviour by newspapers, particularly in Fleet Street, which have done a lot, I think, to undermine the reputation of journalism. This was only being reported in certain outlets, but I actually worked for the Times and the Sunday Times in London as well, and I was well aware of phone tapping going on, of paying police informers, and so on and so forth. So some of this reputational damage has actually, in a sense, been brought as well. I might pause and pass to my colleagues.
I would just make one quick point here, which is that the trust is in part, in my view, a function of the atomized nature of contemporary journalism. We are going back to this question of audience. Audience, of course, can have much more power than they ever did to pick and choose to support, read, and listen and watch the media that supports their worldview. Obviously, Fox News is a sterling example of that in the United States, and as we often discuss in Crikey, so is Sky News After Dark in this country. So people have an inbuilt bias towards media that reinforces their worldview, and seem to me to be less likely to wish to be challenged, which was, let's face it, a traditional function of news journalism. So both the audience and the journalism has changed. And again, I think therein lies a positive thing insofar as we should have better relationships with our audiences. If we don't, it's partly our fault. I agree, we do have a problem with trust in journalism. It pains me, as Andrew very well put it, it's a private grief in many ways. It pains me that the trust is diminishing. But we do have capacity to do something about that. And perhaps this, again, is where better funding models, better business models can come to play.
And I don't want to leave that, but because that to me is the linchpin here. If we are to talk about the issue of public support for public interest journalism, and I'll come to the definition of all of that, then there seems to me a critical issue around the matter of media standards. Yes. There's a critical issue about how we get complaints mechanism in place, given that the Press Council is so grossly inadequate, and given the range of evidence that we've had before us, and the question of regulation, and the fact that we don't want to see government providing advice on what is good journalism, what is bad journalism. I think we'd all agree with that proposition. Certainly in this committee, that's the impression that I'm left with. So I'd ask you, what role do we have, or what mechanism do we have to ensure proper media standards, journalistic ethics and journalistic quality if we are to talk about the issue of public investment, public support for public interest journalism?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think the first issue is that reputable news organisations should have an editorial charter that's signed off by owners and editors. That should reflect probably the code of ethics as outlined by the MEAA and also the Press Council. I think they're kind of prerequisites. There's an argument that, I was reading a piece today that in America, the demise of the ombudsman and woman within organisations, that used to be quite an integral part of newsrooms in America, and they've disappeared. And perhaps there's an argument to bring them back so that readers have a representative within organisations to go to and you go, hey, you know what, this wasn't good or this wasn't right. Maybe that's an expectation that government could have. If they're going to be doling out dollars, then the quid pro quo is that there needs to be someone within your organisation who will listen and act on reader feedback and requests and complaints, because at the moment so many organisations are just sort of islands that refuse to interact with their readers, apart from unidentified comments that are usually more intemperate than what you hear at a football match.
Yeah. Well, can I come to this issue? I mean, I'm a big consumer of media, like all politicians, professional politicians, so we read everything we can get our hands on. And frankly, many independent publications are just as biased, just as ignorant, and the peddlers of untruth as you're alleging occurs in other mainstream mastheads. And I'd say that applies to Crikey. That applies, in many of these so-called bodies that just peddle out neoliberal rubbish about the nature of the economy, for instance. So how do we actually get some sort of definitions here that will provide some real protections in terms of what is public interest journalism and allow for that, nonetheless, diversity of opinion?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Senator, and I'll maybe over a cup of tea sometime we can talk at length about Crikey. But
Yeah, I bet we will.
I'm sure we will enjoy that.
Especially on the auto industry. Yeah, have a great time.
Yes, I'm going to say that was before my time, but I won't say that.
That's when we had one.
Yeah, well, that's right. What auto industry? I think it's important to make a distinction between what we call reporting and what we call opinion. And again, the world we live in, social media world we live in, rewards opinion because opinion outrages people and people share things that they're outraged by. That is a fact of the world we live in. I think it's very important, though, that we have the capacity to have a vibrant opinion base, within journalism.
Yep.
I absolutely. I'm sure you'd agree.
Absolutely.
I think I think, therefore, just to Bruce's point, we do need to adhere to standards, and those standards need to be clear and clean. And we have a very strange situation in this country where, as we all know, we live in a multi-platform universe where previous print publishers are now running TV stations and streaming and all the things that go with it. That we living in a sort of wherever you can find audience, put your content. And yet we still regulate the industry with different bodies, the Press Council and ACMA, various things like that. It seems to me that we should have one standard to fit them all, that should be tied to, if we're going to get funding from the taxpayer, that should be tied to standards. I agree with you. Mm-hmm. And I certainly wouldn't say, I must confess, just to say that, yes, I agree. One of the things that journalism has never been good at is admitting it's wrong. And there needs to be somehow, I think there is a moment for the industry to look at itself and say, we actually stand to benefit if we are more upfront when we are wrong.
Mm-hmm. May I just add, Senator Carr, if you don't mind? There's two quick points I want to make. The first is that I again support what Bruce said about an editorial charter, which needs to be clearly there. But in the 21st century, there's some new developments which I think we should look at. One of them is called the Trust Project, run by Santa Clara University, which has actually documented 10 key points which need to be demonstrated before a website or a service is determined to have a tick as a trusted outlet. I think that deserves looking at. And on the flip side, I also encourage investment or support for media literacy education, both for the general public, but also particularly in schools. Now, this media literacy needs to include an understanding of the importance of provenance of information, which means where does this information come from, who pays for it, how it's funded, if there are any conflicts of interest, and also if it does have a corrections policy, for example, and an editorial charter. Yeah. So I think these are terribly important on the supply side, on the demand side, as opposed to just the supply side.
Well, can I turn then to the issue of public funding? Mr. Jaspan, you've proposed, and we have the supplementary submission which we've just received, Independent Future Fund for Journalism. For the Hansard record, it'd probably benefit if we could get some explanation of what you're proposing. But specifically, are you proposing a broad-based digital services or digital advertising tax along the lines that's supported by Malcolm Turnbull?
Broadly, yes. My issue is this, that in much the same way as my two colleagues have said previously, we do not think that an intervention into the market in terms of breaking up media conglomerates is necessarily the best way forward. What we're really interested in is how do we find a mechanism which will allow new voices to enter into the market, but particularly to address areas of market failure. You again have picked up on these, Senator Carr, the police rounds, the courts, the regional coverage and so on and so forth. The areas that the market can't support. Also, to Bruce's earlier point, these are areas which are not clickbait per se, and they don't attract large audiences. So what we're talking about is serving the public interest, making sure that the lights stay on in certain town halls, or at the very least that those charged with a watchdog role can do role. In terms of how we do it, what I've put forward in that proposal, which, as I say, was at the invitation of the ACCC, was to utilise something like a levy of 10% on the overall revenues of Google and Facebook. And when I wrote that, it was in the order of 6 billion. So what we're saying is we're not going to intervene in the ability for Google and Facebook to operate in Australia. What we are saying is you are taking super profits out of Australia, which are being billed through low tax havens in Singapore and Ireland. What we're saying is you're still making a lot of money. We're going to clip 10%. You can retain the 90 you still have. But that 10% is equivalent to around 600 million a year, which goes into a fund, and that fund will be properly conceived to have editorial charters and other controls to ensure that it's used adequately to address areas of market failure.
I see. So this is in addition to the agreements struck with individual publishers or to replace them?
In addition.
I see. Actually, that'll go down well. Mr. Guthrie and Mr. Fray, if you could perhaps assist the committee in terms of providing us with some advice as to other propositions that are about in terms of providing funding. I'm thinking specifically about the use of the taxation system. Mm-hmm. The Public Interest Journalism Initiative has been proposed, which is an adaptation of the existing R&D tax incentive. I presume you're familiar with that proposal, and it can provide administrative structures through the ATO, same as the R&D tax concession. It can set down specific criteria in terms of what's justified as or what's defined as public interest journalism, and of course can be regulated to stop rorting. So I'm wondering if you have any view about that operation. Is that a useful tool to actually facilitate additional investment?
Well, I think on the R&D, I think the New Daily has actually benefited from that in the past. I think when we did a big tech upgrade, we were given a grant, and that was very helpful. I think it was about $100,000. So any extension that would be welcome. The point here is there's one set of initiatives you could take for the whole market, and I know that News Corp, I think, is suggesting that subscriptions be tax deductible, which is great if you've got a paywall, but startups don't have paywalls. Startups don't have subscribers. So I'm not sure the benefit there. I'm concentrating particularly on initiatives that might assist new entrants rather than existing entrants. And they're things like, the New Daily is now 7 years old, and now we're probably over the worst now, but we could have definitely used some government advertising, say. Yes. I mean, the government advertises tens of millions of dollars a year. Federal's probably 100 million and state's probably that again. And we see none of it. And a government could just mandate that...
Even more in the 12 months before an election, I'd suggest.
Absolutely.
Good point. See, that's an additional measure on top of support through the taxation system. So you're saying grants?
Yes.
You're saying advertising procurement?
Yes.
Government procurement. Mm. You're saying the taxation system, and you're also saying direct subsidies, as I understood your initial comment, for journalism employment.
Yeah, I mean, the fund is one idea that could be based on R&D, the principles that now exist. The idea I put up was specifically for a startup. So let's say in the first 3 years, they want to put on 10 journalists and that costs, let's say, $750,000. They would be able to go to the fund and they would get half of that from the fund. Mm. And that would allow them to put on the 10 journalists. Mm. There would be probably guidelines on what sort of journalism they might be required to do. So you couldn't put them on, repackaging social media stories.
But that's what you set the criteria.
Yep.
Yes, but is there anything necessarily wrong with providing industry-wide measures, even if they are for established companies?
Not necessarily. I mean, I would prefer, for instance, the Media Bargaining Code is somewhat of a lost opportunity. I mean, there's probably $150 million that will now come out of that fund, and probably all but 10 million will go to News Corp 9, 7 West, you know. It's the same people all the time.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm labouring with is, how do you, by all means do that, great, get them to the bargaining table, get some dough out of them. But what about startups and small-sized publishers who are just being left behind all the time? And if we're going to get new voices, we've got to give them more of a leg up. And so, and the tax system is complicated, isn't it? I mean, you know, you tweak it. My accountant says any tweak is going to drive him crazy. So I've tried to zero.
Well paid for that, though.
I'll pay for that. When I rang him and said, I'm doing this, can you help me? I'm sure I'll get a bill. But, you know, I think I'm trying to find ways that don't necessarily involve the tax system. AAP must be supported because News Limited will knock them off. Is there a fund? Yes, hopefully. ABC, make their content available. Why is the ABC content not available to startups and medium-sized publishers? Because if you have ABC content, you then have news content and people will come back to your site every day and that builds traffic.
Can I ask you to expand on that? This is where you talked about a kind of a commons content platform or something from ABC. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew will speak very well on this because one of his initiatives at the conversation was to embrace Creative Commons. So where you can republish material on the conversation, providing you abide by their editorial standards. So you can't change the copy, you can't change headlines, which is exactly the arrangement we had with the ABC, but we had to pay them $70,000 a year. And they've now cut that off. I don't understand why that shouldn't be available to all Australian publishers. Why not? And certainly medium-sized publishers and small publishers would kill for it. Perhaps Andrew could expand on the Creative Commons.
Mr. Fray, I want to hear from you on innovation as well, given your invitation earlier in the today.
I don't know where we might have lost Andrew. I don't know. Well.
No, I am here. Sorry, I am here. Yes, just very quickly, Creative Commons is a wonderful way of sharing your content at no cost to the end user. The key point here is that the ABC produces content, and of course the ABC is funded by the taxpayer. That content should be available to all, and it is. You can go to any ABC website and view it or read it online. I think what Bruce is suggesting is that much like a newswire service from AAP, becomes freely available to all outlets across Australia as a newswire, as it were, which would be a tremendous resource. In the case of the conversation, one of the reasons we ensured that the content was free was that the conversation is authored by academics who are paid for by universities, and therefore the universities receive a public subsidy, as it were, through support from the Department of Education, and that knowledge and that research should be made widely available, which is why we chose to publish everything under a license called Creative Commons, which allows anybody to use it for free and to access it for free as well, on the basis that, you know, we believe that information should flow.
We've just lost you.
I think he's done for now.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay.
Just on this innovation point, I just wanted to make, so I was invited or appointed by Minister Fletcher to be part of the advisory on the first round of those rural innovation grants, rural and small publishers, I think was the title. I think the issue that bamboozled the committee a little bit, the advisory, was the understanding in the news media industry, especially in regional areas, but not only in regional areas, of what actually is innovation. And so I would bring this point up because if we are really going to support the news media industry, and in particular in the bush, but not only, I think there's lots of places that need it, we do probably not wish to restrict it to a word like innovation, or we need to be very, very clear about what innovation actually is. For a lot of these smaller regional publishers in particular, but smaller in our cities as well, it really is about keeping the lights on. keep doing public interest journalism. It's got nothing much to do with innovation. I want nothing more than have an innovative news media sector, but I want actually having a news media sector before I want that. I just think we need to be careful if we're going to link any form of tax incentive or any form of government assistance solely to innovation.
Okay. Have you got any other questions, Senator
Oh,
Carr?
no, I think David's got a question, hasn't he?
David, Senator Fawcett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your submission and your evidence. Sorry I wasn't here for your opening statements. In your submission, the last dot point on your ideas, you talk about fostering small micro media startups, particularly in regional markets. We've had other evidence, particularly from broadcasters, arguing that concentration is actually the only way you'll get the scale required to remain viable in regional markets. Are you predominantly looking there at print media, whether that be paper or online, or are you suggesting that micro is also an option in broadcast, whether that be radio or television?
Well, can I just take that first? They would say that, wouldn't they? And I respect their right to say it. What I think, just to the point of the audience, audiences are pretty savvy these days. Audiences understand they can get their news media content from all sorts of places. We shouldn't be hamstrung by what form that content is in, because people are totally au fait and willing to accept news in all sorts of forms, audio, video, whatever, graphics, what have you. So I think we have outdated ideas if we think we should only support one sector over another. In relation to microsites, there are great examples around the country. I would refer to, say, the Terrier in Warrnambool, for instance, where the journalists there, a one-woman show, has created an audience that support her style of great investigative journalism, which essentially is distributed through Facebook and on a website. So yes, I think it's quite possible to have these micro audiences, micro sites, and they do add to the local ecosystem much, as well as, and I'm not suggesting we knock off Win or Prime or anything, but I'm just saying we can have it all if we're smart about it.
Any other comments on that question?
Well, Senator, I would just say that we've had the days where 2 or 3 publishers each employ 200-300 journalists, and those days are gone. And in many ways, rather than have a couple of employers employing 500 journalists, I think we should be striving to have 50 organisations employing 10 journalists. I think maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe we still have the major publishers, but we've got to do more to have smaller publishers employing small groups of journalists and perhaps all being good at 1 or 2 things. We've got to get more voices into the landscape.
With the other dot points, some of which Senator Carr covered off in his questioning, have you done any modelling to look at, particular states, regional sectors, etc., to understand what kind of tax relief or incentivisation for philanthropic investment? You've got a number of options there. Are they thought bubbles at this point in time, or have you actually done some serious modelling that would demonstrate the ability to sustain given sectors or diversity in given regions, for example?
I would refer to the work of PIGI, the Public Interest Journalism Initiative. They've done some good work, particularly around tax systems. There's been some academic work done by a mob I used to be associated with, the Centre for Media Transition, and others. I think there's could be more specific modelling. It would be a great project, for instance, for the Parliamentary Library.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Guthrie, do you have anything to add to that?
My final...
Sorry,
my final
Senator
question,
Fawcett, continue.
My final question, perhaps, you've suggested the idea of the ABC making its product available for free for publishers around the country to use. Is the inverse also something that would be attractive to regional or small publishers and journalists that, if you like, the quid pro quo is that a journalist who might be operating in a small country town gets his or her content published via the ABC.
Look, I think that's not a bad idea, actually. I think that it would come down to individual publishers, but certainly if a regional publisher suddenly had a national audience, that would do fantastic things for their traffic. But I think it would come down to individual publishers, Senator.
And Senator, you missed it, but in our opening remarks, I've made a reference to the BBC's local news partnerships, which is potentially a model by which the BBC reporters and a local external news provider work together on projects, say, for instance, covering courts or what have you. So, yes, I do think there's great potential for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, gents.
Okay. Well, thank you to all three of you for appearing today, and your submission and the various other bits and pieces that you've given us supplementary wise. Thank you. If there's any questions that you were asked to take on notice, just be in touch with the Secretariat. We've still got a way to go with this inquiry, so if there are things that, based on this conversation or others that we've had with other witnesses that you think is worth feeding into us, follow up, please don't hesitate. We do intend on having, we do want to put solutions forward, and that's the main focus of what I want to see out of this. So thank you. All right.